Thank you very much indeed, Tim, and thank you, David. Tim, thank you so much indeed for all the amazing things that you're doing here. So, thank you for everyone for being here and being interested in this subject, and being interested potentially in the book, but also for supporting Bembridge Fort, because it is a remarkable, a really remarkable location, and I had the pleasure of being shown around by David a few weeks ago. So I'm really looking forward to this place taking on a new lease of life. And having listened to the heavy metal band in this very small location, you do need earplugs. And so lovely to see you. I've got a thank you card for you, but I needed to check your address first, and so I literally have it in my satchel. So please don't leave up until I give you the thank you card for the.
You're signing my books.
Fantastic. Okay, I'd love to do that. We are in a Palmerston Folly. I'm going to make a very quick link to the book. We're in a Palmerston Folly, and these series of forts built all around not only the Isle of Wight but Solent in order to protect the fleet at Portsmouth, because the fleet was the symbol of British power. It protected our island, it defended the empire, it allowed the destruction of slavery, and it enabled British foreign policy throughout the 19th century. And they're known as follies because they were quite expensive, and in the end we didn't go to war. I'm not sure that's my definition of a folly. I think that's my definition of very successful deterrence. Because even if these forts had cost 3 times, 5 times or 10 times the price, war, as we found out in the Great War and the Second World War, and indeed the Cold War, fighting these wars is extraordinarily expensive. And one of the things that we are failing to do, and we've sort of really started to fail to do in the last 10, 20 years, is to deter people from doing things that we don't like and failing to protect our nation. And I think that's beginning to happen not only with the Russians but potentially with the Chinese as well, and we can discuss all that later. What I'm going to, and also thank you, you're very early, so I suspect there's a few ex-military people in the audience as well, judging by your timings. I'm going to talk, I try not to talk for too long, but obviously you want a decent talk. So I'm going to talk for between 20 minutes and half an hour. I like to say 20, it normally drags on to about 30. And then what I'd like to do as much as possible is to take questions, and so that people can go if they need to. But also I sort of want you to guide the conversation, because I don't know what you know, I don't know what you don't know, but also what you're interested in finding out. And really this is a talk about modern warfare, but clearly I talk about it through my book. And I do so in 2 ways. Well, the book has a couple of purposes. I tell the stories of individual people who have fought the war, but I also tell the story of the Ukraine war. But more than that, as well as telling the story about a single war, a very significant war, the largest in Europe, and you've got in the Russian dictator someone who is potentially going to be threatening NATO states, I also tell a wider story about the future of warfare, because Putin's form of new integrated war, where he combines all the tools of state power to be used in a malign way against us and to increase his own power and the power of the Russian state, it is a form of war that is going to be increasingly used against us, whether it's by China, whether it's by Russia, or whether it's by other actors such as Iran. So it is a form of war that we need to understand. And I tell that story in 2 ways. I tell it through people. So we've got Panushka on the front cover, one of Ukraine's best snipers. David, can you call up the next? I'm not quite sure which picture she's on. Keep going. I'm just going to look back. Here we are. Back one. Thank you so much indeed. So this is Panushka. Her weapon is about the same size as her. And that's the smaller of her 2 weapons. The Barrett is actually larger than she is. And so I tell the story of the Ukraine war through a series of characters. I had the contract for the book whilst I was still the Member of Parliament for the island, and then after the tsunami of the last election, 9 a.m. the following morning, I thought, okay, I'm going to get on with the rest of my life now. And the rest of my life at that time, I've got a few other jobs going as well, but at that time it was just to finish this book. So half of it had already been written because it was effectively a readable version of my PhD, and I promise you it is readable, because I was never much of an academic writer. But I also then went off to Ukraine and embedded with units, spent time in frontline cities, occasionally on the front line where I needed to. It's not somewhere I recommend you go, thanks to the saturation of drone warfare. We'll come to that. But I spent time with the Ukrainians who were fighting this war, and I added sort of 7 colours of what journalists would call colour. So feature writing about the people I was meeting and telling the story through people, because we love stories about human beings. So this is a book about, it's about the story of war, but I tried to tell it as much as possible by telling it through the experiences of people like Panushka. And Panushka, twice a week, she goes off to no man's land to kill Russians. You know, there's no mincing about those words. She told me the most difficult thing that she's done in the last year is not her job, which is incredibly dangerous. And every time I go there, I expect to hear that she's dead. Miraculously, she still isn't. The most difficult thing that she's done during the course of the war was to bury her fiancé, who was killed in a missile strike, a random missile strike in Odessa. And it was a very illegal missile strike because the Russians hit probably a military target, to be fair. And then when the emergency services and Sasha, her husband, had turned up, they then, double tapped it, so hit it again, knowing that emergency services would be there. And it's one of the many, many common but very illegal tactics that the Russians use. And so despite the fact that she risks her life on a weekly basis, the most difficult thing that Panushka has done in this war was actually to bury her partner. I spoke to doctors who were building underground operating theatres, so when the Russians were methodically destroying the hospitals that they were working in, which they are doing, they would have somewhere to treat their patients. To children stolen by the Russian state. And one of the things we don't quite understand because of our view of what warfare is and isn't, a lot of these things that are core Russian tactics, like the freezing of the Ukrainian population by destroying power stations, the stealing of children, we sort of think these are bad things that happen in war, but we don't necessarily see them as a form of war. But they are absolutely core components in Russia's theory of conflict. And one of the things I argue in the book, and I'll come to it shortly, is that we need to have a much, even if we don't think it is as a form of war, as a form of conflict, because our enemies do, whether it's Russia or whether it's China using economic power and espionage power that we're reading about all the time at the moment, we need to understand other people's definitions of conflict, because these are forms of conflict that are being practiced against us. And if we don't see ourselves as being in conflict with these states, and whether we like it or not, these states actually see themselves as being not at war with us, but certainly in conflict with us, we are increasingly unable to defend themselves. And one of the things that I found which was so depressing is, and actually one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I've seen it firsthand that neither our political classes nor even sometimes our military classes have a really an understanding of conflict that I think is needed in this day and age. I spent time actually talking to Russian prisoners of war, including one guy called Zayats. He was a very, very short guy, and Zayats, that you get given your code, you get given your call sign. And Zayats, despite being very short, Zayats' hair in Russian, as in the animal, so I presume that Russian irony is not dead yet. Zayats was talking about the stories that he and all these other people told me were really sort of eye-opening. That he volunteered, he was in a penal colony because he was a burglar, and one day the Russian recruiting sergeants turned up and said, don't worry, you're not going anywhere near the front line, you'll be doing a mechanic's job, it'll be well paid, and you can get out of prison where you're currently doing 8 years for burglary. He signs up, he's on a plane to Rostov the next day. The only time that the Russian state really acts quickly is getting all these penal colony troops to the front line, and then the flash to bang, as the military would say, is really very, very quick. So the next day he's on a plane to Rostov and he's still in his flip-flops. He gets off the plane at the other end and he is told, right, you're an assault troop now, you're a storm troop, whether you like it or not. And he's thinking, oh dearie me. And he had a very bad feeling as soon as he got off the plane, because you're given money straight into a bank account, quite a large amount of money to sign up, and you're given your bank card with your name on it, and it's sort of, so this is your money. The minute he gets off the plane at Rostov-on-Don, the sergeant takes that and said, you won't be needing that anymore. He spends 3 weeks being trained, which is longer than quite a lot of them actually, living in, effectively living in a trench while he's doing the training, trained by Congolese mercenaries employed by the Wagner group. I'll come to them if anyone wants to ask me questions about that. People occasionally try to escape, and the treatment of them is extraordinarily brutal. And I remember he told me one scene, and the imagery of it really stuck with me. And it was a bombed out basement of a hospital. And on one side you had these Russian troops, and they are, all the stories you hear is not the half of it with these people. They are not well cared for when they're injured. They're very often just left to die. And so you had these people sort of on these sort of pus-strewn mattresses, no medical treatment apart from an orderly with zero medical experience, cleaning their wounds before reapplying the same bandages. Zayat said to me it was like a vision from hell. So that was on one side, and he said, I remember the quote, it's a great quote, he said, they smelt as if they were rotting alive. And on the other side of the room, a prisoner, one of his comrades who tried to escape, was trussed up with iron bars. Imagine sort of you've got a meat hook up there, and he was trussed up with sort of cufflinks and trussed on this sort of meat hook. And all the recruits had to watch this because they were told this is what happens if you try to run away again. And he was slowly beaten to death with 2 bats. Zayat himself was then shot in the back, the first assault against the Ukrainian troops. It was a flesh wound, and he kept on running, and that's how I met him eventually, because he was a Ukrainian prisoner of war. So lots of stories of lots of individuals, but primarily this is a book about what Russian warfare is, because we have to deal with it, but it's also a book about modern warfare. And what I'm going to do briefly now is just to run through my arguments, and where I've got a decent picture, even now or in the questions, I'll talk about them. The pictures in the book, I have to say, are very beautiful. I took one of my oldest friends, Annabel Moeller. She went to school in Shanklin, I think, what was that private school in Shanklin that shut down a few years ago? Upper China, that was it. She was a nice Isle of Wight girl. So she went, Annabel and I went off, and she took some really stunning pictures. In fact, let's put up another one. Can we put up that red? There's a very red one, which is where I open the book. That one. Sadly, you can't really see what this is. I do apologise. We've got almost too much light at the front. Obviously, for anyone who knows anything about war, you don't wander around with a white torch on the front line because you tend to get blown up. So we had a red torch, and this is Sonic, call sign Sonic, because he's got spiky hair, and I think he looks like Sonic the Hedgehog for people who know video games. And again, you don't get to choose your own call sign. He is arming a bomber drone, and the saturation of drones is becoming one of the most unique features of the conventional part of this war. And this war has many conventional but also not unconventional aspects. But how physical war, the war that we imagine is changing, is because drones are becoming, and autonomous drones are now becoming, the dominant tool. Once upon a time, the most likely way of being killed in war was a mortar shell. Now, 3/4 of casualties are either through bomber drones or suicide drones, known euphemistically in NATO as one-way effectors, and those are the drones, a bit smaller than this. This is quite a large drone, so it's a pentacopter, so it's got 5 blades that take off and carry 2 either mortar shells or 1 large anti-tank mine, which can do a lot of damage to a trench and just has a lot of explosive power. But Sonic is arming this, and we're on the front line, and I open the book on the front line, sort of sitting there watching him launch it, and watching his comrade Kalaso, call sign, which is wheel in Ukrainian, drive these the bomber drones just relentlessly all night onto the Russian lines, just killing soldiers after soldiers. And yet, because the Russians are able to recruit 30,000 troops a month, they can lose 30,000 troops a month, and they are. It's, the Russian death toll is truly extraordinary. So anyway, I'm just going to run through some of the arguments, and then we can sort of develop a conversation around some of the pictures as well if we've got time. What I argue in the new total war is that Russia has combined all the powers of the state into an idea of permanent conflict. Effectively, they're unifying military and non-military tools of state power. And that's not me guessing, it's actually just me reading Russian doctrine. And one of the things I do with this book, and partly because it was an academic exercise originally, was to root everything in Russian doctrine. So I'm hoping for an academic audience, and I'm not saying that this is, but for military students, for students of international affairs, for politicians, and for journalists, and for people who study this on a more professional basis, what I've tried to do is to root everything in Russian sourcing, because so much that you read about what Russian warfare is and what's happening, it's not written by people who root their opinions in what the Russians think and do and say. It's what they think. And sometimes that's very original, but actually for this book to have worth in 5 and 10 and 15 years' time, it needs to be rooted in what Russian ideas of war are. And so everything I do is rooted as much as possible in what Russian doctrine actually says itself. And if you go to the first characteristic of Russian warfare in the Russian military doctrine, and you can find it in English on the web, but I use the Russian original, there's some nuances that are different. It is the integration of military and non-military tools. And the Russians then say that is economics, that's political warfare, that's informational warfare, and various other things, be it cyber operations. And they don't necessarily state what those other things are, apart from saying operations of a special nature, which is incredibly catch-all, because frankly it can mean anything you want it to mean. But they specifically say economics, politics, and informational and other tools. Now, I stress, this is in military doctrine. So the Russians think that energy, sort of gas warfare, be it over Nord Stream 2, the German-Russian pipeline, be it about gas prices in Ukraine to try to manipulate governments, be it over informational warfare, disinformation, corruption of our politicians, we may not think of this as a form of conflict and war, but they do, and it's in their doctrine, as these are, even if they're political tools or informational tools or economic tools, they are seen as tools of conflict within Russia's definition of conflict. And that was really important for me, because this is a whole state form of conflict which is aimed at us, whether we see this as being primarily conflict or not. Second, Russia's way of war is the integration of two ways of war of the 20th century, one of which we don't even see as a form of warfare. And this is one of the historical academic arguments that I put forward. There are two ways of warfare with these. The first one is the one we all know. It's the warfare that we imagine, in our imaginations, of tanks and planes and people in uniform, men and women doing battle. It's a recognisable war according to, the Western tradition of war. The Russians did a lot of really great work on that in the 1920s and 30s. I say great, impressive work on that in the 1920s and 30s. Coming up with terms like operational art and deep battle. And that was, when you combine all the elements of the military seamlessly into a single whole, so everything is working together, which is actually in warfare much more difficult than it sounds. It's a statement of obvious, but as anyone from a military background knows, actually achieving that is another matter entirely. So it's about using all these to drive deep into breaking through the enemy, and then to continually be able to reinforce that. And that is something that militaries have struggled with. In the 1980s and 90s, when the United States was rethinking how to do very fast maneuver warfare, punching through, really going for it at the enemy, and having the ability to keep going, as in the beginning of the Second Iraq War, if you remember the images, they based a lot of their thinking, or they were inspired by the work that the Soviets did in the 1920s and 30s, before the Soviets, these experts, were killed off by Stalin, effectively. So that was the first way of war, the conventional way of war that we all understand in our minds. It's uniforms, tanks and planes and warships, etc. There was, I argue in the book, and I think I'm right, so I argue it, a second way of war. And that we don't really recognise as a way of war, but we need to do so, because A, it was, and B, it is part of the forms of conflict that are being used against us now. And that second way of war, and again, parts of this are going to be familiar to folks here who remember the Cold War, and I remember the Cold War, so I suspect that many people here also remember the Cold War. It was the warfare of the KGB and the warfare of the Communist Party. What was that? It was CND. It was paramilitary revolutions in the Third World. It was supporting Palestinian terrorism, which was still ongoing. It was the use of economics, it was the use of espionage, it was the use of endless repetitive disinformation and propaganda campaigns. It was the use or the threat of the use of nuclear weapons to scare Western populations, stuff that's still happening now. So all these forms of war, the espionage and spying, the political warfare, the subversive warfare, sometimes known as active measures, that was the name that the KGB gave to this form of warfare. We don't necessarily see it as a form of warfare, but it was something that was pretty much practiced against us during the Cold War, certainly from the late 60s onwards, almost every day. But we haven't seen it as a form of warfare in its own right, and one of the things that I argue is that we need to see that as a form of warfare because our enemies do. And I'm a patriot, I love my country. But since the 1990s, I think we have forgotten to see the world through others' eyes. And too often our foreign policy, whether it was Labour, whether it was our own side, has tended to be an expression of virtue signalling rather than dealing with the problems, the hard and difficult problems of a world in which many people do not see the world as we do. And with the Russians, the Chinese and the Iranians, these are people with, rightly or wrongly, grievances. And the Russians have not seen the world as we have. And yet we have continued to believe as if state-on-state conflict was a thing of the past, all we had to do was a little bit of virtue signalling every so often, and it didn't do us any good. Anyway, okay, so if so many of the tools of this warfare are part of the past, is it actually new? Because I call the book The New Total War. My argument, and it's not just to sell the book, is that actually, yes, it is a new form of warfare. It's certainly new enough to be called new, because there are new aspects of it. The Soviets only went and developed relationship with naive Western groups and left-wing political parties. But now they use the hard left, the hard right, opportunistic lawyers and bankers and people who are willing to make money to do the Kremlin's bidding. The whole field of cyber warfare is new. Stealing information isn't new, but cyber, how you do it, has revolutionized spying, as we're finding out from the Chinese just this week, but also the Russians, when you've got MI5 and GCHQ, our listening people, our cyber sleuths and cyber experts, saying that we're being overrun. So for me, there are enough new parts of this, both in Putin's thinking, but also in the practicalities of it, to say that this is new. And I also say it's new because we've got to get our heads around what this new form of warfare actually means and is. Okay, third or fourth, I think, I argue a point that a lot of Ukrainians are now accepting, but wouldn't have done just a few years ago. I argue that if you look at Russian doctrine, and one of the things that Russian doctrine, or the head of the Russian army has said specifically, is that actually nowadays wars start a long time before people think that war has started. And he said that in a very famous essay in 2013, just before the first Ukrainian invasion in 2014. And so using some quotes from Russian leaders like Gerasimov, but also looking at Russian doctrine, I argue that the Ukraine war has now been going on for 20 years, it's just that we haven't really realised it. So the Ukraine war didn't start in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, which dominated all our TV screens. It didn't even start in 2014 with that first invasion, the annexation of Crimea and the first invasion of the Donbass that some of you may remember seeing on the telly. The Ukraine war actually started in 2005. If you look at Putin's actions, in 2005, after a pro-democracy uprising in Kiev overthrew the rigged presidential election results and forced a runoff, and the pro-Western candidate won. He messed up when he was in power, that's another matter. But in 2005, Putin said, we've got to stop Ukraine's westward drift, we're getting Ukraine back within the Slavic fold, it's going to become part of one union state with Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, and we're going to start doing this now. If you look from 2005, you will find in economics and the use of oligarchs, I'll come to that in a minute because it's fascinating, disinformation. If you look at all the tools, there was a systemic uptick in Russian activity in Ukraine. And so applying the rules of Russian ideas of warfare, that sometimes it's military and sometimes it's not, Ukraine was in conflict with Russia, or that in Putin's mind he was in conflict with Ukraine from 2005 onwards until 2013. And so what did that look like? Espionage, really corrupting Ukraine's spies and defence, hollowing out its relationship with NATO, making sure that heavy weapons were removed from the Crimea, using Russian front oligarchs armed with sweetheart deals from Gazprom, with billions, literally billions of dollars in their pockets to buy up swathes of Ukrainian industry, establish political parties, control politicians who at the best of the time in Ukraine are pretty corrupt anyway, but simply to control them through vast sums of money, and effectively present the country to itself and to the West as a failed state, which it was becoming, whilst at the same time buying its political classes, buying most of its industry. I'll give you another example. The Russians collapsed a bank because they wanted control of the financing of Ukrainian arms firms, so they could actually run that financing down, but they could find out exactly who was making what, whether they could buy it, how much of a threat it was, how could they stymie that development to make sure that Ukraine could never defend itself. And so I think in 2008, if I remember the date, there was a forced run on a Donetsk, an East Ukrainian bank. It was the bank that did most of the banking for most of the arms companies, or the arms industry in eastern Ukraine. The bank collapses, it's then bought by a front of the Russian spy agency, the FSB. So almost overnight, the FSB is in control of the bankers of the Ukrainian arms industry, and they can find out who's making what, who's in financial trouble, who's doing very well, what kit they have. And from there they develop relationships in order to corrupt and control and manipulate a former chunk effectively of the Soviet arms industry, so it becomes much less of a threat in future to the Russians. And indeed the amount of Russian kit, or the Ukrainian kit, that the Russians either bought, either through organised crime or directly and openly, was very, very significant. And even now the Ukrainians cynically say to themselves, we're being killed with the kit that we sold to the Russians 15 years ago. I'm in no, by the way, just on this point, I'm in no, there's sort of, the way that you read the Western media, you think that the Russians are entirely evil and the Ukrainians are all innocent and sort of angelic. They're not. Ukraine had quite a corrupted state. But I make a huge distinction between the Ukrainian state, which was very post-Soviet, and also the Ukrainian nation. And the people fighting to save their nation now are not necessarily elements of the Ukrainian state, although the state is doing a better job than it used to. But it's the Ukrainian nation, and it's the people who identify as being members of that Ukrainian nation, because they know that if they lose this war, many of them will wind up dead, their women will wind up raped, their children will wind up stolen and taken to Russia and indoctrinated. So they are fighting to save themselves very literally. But certainly the corruption, the organised crime, and the post-Soviet nature of Ukraine enabled the Russians and gave them an in a way that they would not have into more honest and transparent states like ours. Although, having said that, the Russians did quite a bit to try to corrupt not only our law, but also our banking industry, but that's another matter. One of the things that we're getting from there now, I think, is a real blurring of the terms war and peace. Russia, by combining the traditional with the subversive, Russia's new war blurs the boundaries of war and peace and allows Putin to present himself in effectively eternal conflict with the West. Whether that conflict is a real one in Ukraine, or whether it's an informational one, I say real one, whether it's a military war, or whether it's a conflict over values, over posturing, over disinformation and information campaigns and espionage. But for him, he needs to present Russia as being in eternal conflict with the West. And actually, interestingly, now that they're not quite sure how to play Putin in Russia, the Russian propaganda in the last 6 months, really over the last year, but certainly the last 6 months, makes out Britain to be its single eternal enemy. And they portray us as not only being corrupt and knackered and past our best and a sort of a bunch of post-imperial losers and in hoc to gay, Jewish, Nazi, transgender, obsessives, what have you. But yet at the same time, we are surreptitiously behind every sort of move of this corrupt international order against whom the mighty Putin is valiantly fighting. It's like a bad James Bond movie when we're the bad guys. Advanced information. There's a lot of talk about information warfare and we see it all the time about propaganda. It is really important because Putin's war starts in his mind, and his ultimate targets, even in conventional war, is our mind. And the Russian warfare sees the mind as the central background or the central battlefield in any war. So even now in Ukraine, where we've got this full-scale invasion and a very, very big war clearly that's happening, that's taking the lives of thousands of people a week, even now we have a mixture of tools, and Ukraine and Putin's target ultimately remains in the informational and psychological space. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's three core elements to Russian strategy now. The first one is to hold the line and from there make grinding progress by destroying one city at a time through its, just obliterating it through artillery and slowly making that military progress. Very often, if need be, through these horrendous meat assaults, where simply they are not dissimilar to human wave attacks. If people remember the stories of Stalingrad and indeed other communist regimes, where you literally just point a weapon at the back of people and say, if you don't charge at the enemy, you can die here and now, or you can die running at the enemy, it's your choice. And the Russians have now evolved that to repeated small-scale attacks, and if you don't do it, you will be shot. And the reason why the Russians are still fighting is because they fear their commanders more than they fear the Ukrainians. If you run at the Ukrainians, you either get shot or taken prisoner. If you get taken prisoner, actually, it's not too bad. It's probably better than you're treated by the Russians. If you refuse to go, you're shot or you're put in a pit and you're weed on and you're beaten slowly to death or whatever, or you're punished in some disgustingly brutal way. So what the Russians have done now is evolve that human sort of wave to effectively small teams armed with weapons, with ammunition, running at the enemy with about 50% casualty rate. So you run across a field, the Ukrainians shoot at you. So your commanders in the back, they can see the Ukrainian position. So they can identify the Ukrainian positions one at a time, and they will then drop artillery on them, they will drop drones on them. If the squad that's run at the Ukrainian lines is dead, they just send in another 4 to 6 men. And so I had this one of the bosses of one of these units explaining this to me, that you have this repetitive cycle that 6 men, 6 Russians will run at you, you'll shoot 3 of them will be killed, 3 of them will make the position, and then another 6 will come and you'll kill 3, but 3 of them will get through, and then they move on to another position, you kill half of them. So even with 50% casualty rates at every go, the Russians will keep coming at you, and the Ukrainians are literally running out of infantry. And one of the things I do, let's change the picture, can we go and find a guy I'm talking to called Koz? He's got a big black and white flag up.
Let's see what.
No, I think. Here we go. Keep going. Keep going.
I think that's the last one.
Can we go backwards until we find me chatting to a bloke with a moustache who looks like a young Hercule Poirot? That's it, but it's with when I'm talking to him, so keep going. And hopefully, by the time we get to the picture, I will still remember the point I'm making. There we are. So you talk to the Ukrainians, people like Koz here, and this is, we're just behind the front line. It's actually, it's the oddest place I've ever interviewed anyone, was in a Ukrainian sauna just off the front line. But his regiment, this is their rear HQ, and so if you've been on the front line, you then come back for a period of time, and there's rest and relaxation, and you're less likely to be bombed. You're still getting bombed, but not by drones, because you're just out of drone range. and they've got this fantastic sauna which they've sort of rigged up. It's very incredibly basic, but just for their men when they come off the front line, as I say, for rest and relaxation. So I joined them in the sauna that evening, and as I say, it was the oddest place I've ever interviewed anyone. And I had this Russian prisoner of war. I don't know, does anyone know they're sort of Slavic or Scandinavian saunas? You get slightly whipped by birch leaves and that sort of thing. And I had a Russian prisoner of war thwacking me. Yes, taking out his frustrations on a NATO member. So what's I taking? Yeah, and so the Ukrainians it's bizarre the experiences that the Ukrainians are having, because they're killing these people endlessly, repetitively, on a daily, weekly basis. And the frustration that they have, I was talking to one drone pilot, and even she was exasperated. It was a she, and she was like one of these sort of tech. She'd been a web designer in her in her civilian life, and I said, what's the war taught you? And she said, well, I was never a pacifist, but I thought I could kill somebody, but it turns out I can. And I remember another sort of fascinating quote is that when somebody gives you a quote, it just makes you think. And she was telling me that they just drop bombs on the same on the same positions, or their drones drop bombs in the same positions day in, day out. And because the Russian system is so centralized, and generals are making very, very tactical decisions from 50, 100 miles away, they never change their routes into battle. And so people like Kos, they're killing people coming over the same hill every day repetitively. But the problem is they're running out of troops. And there's 3 ways out for Ukrainians, because when British soldiers, we do a 6-month tour. Even if it's a bad 6-month tour in a place like Sangin in Afghanistan, you do 4 months, you get R&R for 2 weeks, you do another 6 weeks, and then you're home. These people have been fighting now for some of them more than 3 years. And the only ways out are death, injury, or desertion. And the desertion rates in Ukraine for infantry soldiers are relatively high. But actually the remarkable thing is, in many ways, that it's not higher, because people are staying on the front line for months and years at a time. And this guy, Kos, here on the right-hand side, he's probably been in 100 battles. And he was telling me every time he's sort of thinking, wow, that's particularly tough. The next day he'll be getting a call from his HQ. You're going there, you're going there, you're going there. So this guy was a veteran. He's 26, he's a veteran of more battles than probably most British regiments in the last 150 years. And one of the problems is they have to deal with the fact that despite the fact they're killing so many Russians, eventually they run out of people. And so they're now developing a drone industry which is replacing slowly troops. And the regiment, another regiment that I spent time with, in fact the first regiment with the red and black picture that you saw, that regiment's called Hatia, and it's a brand new regiment. And one of the things that they're now doing is taking human beings off the front line. What is the point of having a really highly trained soldier, a highly trained human being? Let's say he's got a computer degree and he's a drone flyer, or he's a paratrooper and he's very buffed. If you're sitting in a trench and a 3-ton Russian bomb hits 200 yards away, you're probably dead. And you've wasted all that extraordinary human talent when all that human being is doing, or required to do, is to shoot Russians coming over the hill, or running out of the wood line, or running over the field. So why can't you get a drone to do that? And so what you now have with the smarter units, and we're not quite there yet, but in about a year's time there will be, where you have land drones, something that looks like almost like a sit-in lawnmower, something about the same size, but instead of having a lawnmower, it's got a heavy machine gun on it. And that heavy machine gun will be controlled at the moment by someone who's 200 metres, maybe 500 metres behind it, and maybe has fibre optic connection, because that fibre optic connection means that you can't, unless the fibre optic cable is destroyed, you can't interfere using electronic warfare. So you're having front lines increasingly guarded by something about this size, which has a heavy machine gun on it, and it's probably got it will obviously have a camera on it as well. Whilst in the sky above you, you have what the Ukrainians refer to as a carousel. So every half a kilometre, you'll have a section of 3 drones. When one drone is on the ground, one drone is in the air, and one drone is probably just about sort of coming into land. And you are guarding your front lines now with increasing automation in a way, because it's an active front line, in a way that is different from places like South Korea. And this is the future of warfare, that mass is going to be created not by human beings anymore, not by the armies we saw here, First World War and Second World War, but mass increasingly is going to be in tech. For the Russians and the Chinese, it may be in tech and in humans, because the Russians are using both forms of mass. Mass is where you have a lot of kit. And one of the arguments about what's happening in the armed forces in the last 20, 30 years is that as they got smaller and smaller and smaller, we've relied on tech and advanced tech, what the army call exquisite technology, in order to do battle. And because we thought the era of state and state conflict is over, that has basically been very expensive drones at really quite a lot of cost, 100, 30 to 100 grand plus, killing individual terrorists or militants. And it's quite an expensive way to do warfare, but it also means that you're not doing mass warfare. And now that we're back in an era of state-on-state competition, and potentially state-on-state warfare, we have to find another way of generating mass, because we can't just walk people to the enemy to have them gunned down, as the Russians are doing now, and sadly we did in places like the Somme. And even then, over 100 years ago, we learned that lesson pretty quickly, and then we produced combined arms war at the end of World War I. Anyway, I digress. And so what they're doing now is that they're using mass in the form of drones and automated drones to make up for their lack of human beings, because people like Cos, all his men are dying. And I said, how do you actually prepare people for death? Because, a lot of your men aren't going to come back. And he says, we talked about it for some time. And it's a really interesting answer he gave. Effectively, people rewire their brains in a different way, and every day is a form of a lifetime, because you can't plan ahead. You can't plan to a month ahead. You can't plan 6 months ahead. So effectively, you are so rooted in the here and now that you live absolutely in the present, because there's no other way of being. Because if you live in the past, you probably get trapped there, and you may have no future. So for us, for people in the Western world, we spend a lot of time either dwelling on the past or thinking or planning for the future. But if you're on the front line there, you can't, because it's incredibly bad for your mental health. So you have to live in the here and now. And when you are alive and you have the sense of being alive, you experience it. And if you don't, you're dead. It's an interesting conversation. Russia's evolving this war because it wants to be a superpower, but it no longer has the ability to be a superpower. Its economy is half our size. I mean, we moan about things being bad in the UK, and they are pretty bad at the moment, actually. But sorry, I shouldn't get into domestic politics at all. We've had better days, but our economy is we're still much richer than Russia. But the Russians, Putin wants to be a superpower, but because he hasn't got the Red Army anymore, and even his spy agencies aren't the size they used to be. So what he's trying to do is use power efficiently. And one of the things he's doing, by combining all the tools of state power in a sort of form of operational art where you combine it for maximum effect, he's creating what people would call synergy. He wants to be more, he wants his power to become more than the sum of its parts, because your information operations combined with your political warfare and maybe an assassination or two, you may be able to change the course of a country without actually going to war. A good example of that now is what's happening in Georgia, where effectively that country is being bought by an oligarch close to the Kremlin, who's effectively setting up rival power structures to undermine transparency and power, but to deliver that country back into the arms of Moscow, by grinding resistance to it down, occasionally by arrests, occasionally by murder, occasionally by bribery, occasionally by the mass bribery of voters, occasionally by information operations, all of which say at the end of the day, look, we've got to live with the Russians, so let's just give them what they want. People are battling with that in Moldova and in the Baltic republics. Let's see where we go in the Baltic republics, but it might be that is the next theatre of war that we're dealing with. But even against us, you have the steady state of information warfare or economic threat and the threat of nuclear weapons in order for Putin to present Russia being in a state of war against the UK. What we don't know is that's just a steady state, and we're going to have to deal with somebody relentlessly attacking our interests when they can throughout the world, or whether that is what the military would call a shaping operation, eventually to conventional war. Not because they want to invade Great Britain, that's a nonsense, but because they want to destroy, and Putin wants to destroy, the power of NATO. Putin has three objectives in his lifetime currently. One is to recreate Russia as a virulently illiberal and anti-Western society, and that's done. Secondly is to destroy an independent NATO, and the jury's still out on that. Thirdly, to break the power of NATO. And what he is fighting in Ukraine at the moment is not the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is a defensive action against NATO. So we are in the first Russia-NATO war. Again, we don't see it like that because we live in our world, which is broadly sensible. But in Putin's world, and in the Russian media, and in the Russian state, and in the Russian people, and Russian identity, or ideas about warfare and identity, Russia is in the first Russia-NATO war. And if he grabs most of Donbass, he will then probably claim victory, and that may happen by next summer. A couple of other points. Being at war, whether it's a real war or whether it's information conflict, espionage and all this sort of stuff, it enables control of populations. And that's the same for any society. I remember when we went to war in Bosnia, the only people involved actively in that war were 8 Harrier pilots. But Blair presented it himself as if it was some great sort of great war of our time, despite an incredibly few people being involved. But war naturally unites, and war makes us more likely to follow authority, but also to be suspicious of people presenting an alternative point of view. And within Russian history, you have this idea of chaos and the danger of chaos, and the demon and the devil of chaos, either being an outside actor, the Antichrist, which is actively, an Antichrist is actively being presented as the United States and NATO, or NATO now, slightly less the US, but the internal Antichrist of chaos. And so by Putin being at war, forcing a unification on the Russian people, or a common shared illiberal identity against NATO and against the European Union, he can be seen as the saviour fighting against the US, NATO, UK Antichrist, but also against the forces of internal disorder. And finally, what do we like for time, David? It's,
you keep going.
I have actually been, okay, this is the problem. I said I'd talk for 20 minutes and and then I waffle for about 45. I will say one other final point and then we'll try to work some more pictures in. Why is this a blueprint for authoritarian dictators? One, because Russia has a morality aside, I'm not talking about morality here, Putin is a genius tactician. He's a strategic disaster for his country because he's delivering his country as a raw material colony to China. No question about that. So he's a strategic disaster for Russia and actually for the Western world, because we should be in a partnership with Russia in the same way that we should be with other potentially allied states. But thanks to Russian creative thinking about warfare, and they do have an extraordinary record over the last 130, 40 years of thinking about warfare and conflict in a creative way. And because of the Bolshevik Revolution being the original workers' revolution, they have influenced China. They have influenced other revolutions that have come afterwards, including Iran's. We tend to think of Iran's revolution as being fundamentally religious, but actually if you look at its structure, arguably it was not dissimilar to the Bolshevik and to the Chinese Communist revolutions. So for these societies, conflict did not start with conventional warfare. If you are a revolutionary, what does warfare start with? What does conflict start with? It starts with an idea. And from that idea, you produce words, you produce propaganda, you produce leaflets, you produce an ideology. So for revolutionary societies, conflict tends to be primarily, first of all, propaganda and information war. And if you look at revolutionary societies, they all share that basic beginning. We are not a revolutionary society. We had a civil war back in the 17th century, and we've had many evolutions and industrial revolutions and political revolutions, but we've never had the collapse and the overthrow of the state, not since 1066, and that was a long time ago. And so we tend to think about warfare, as I said at the beginning, about warfare and conflict in different ways. But for the Russians, as the first worker state, as the first sort of people to use propaganda in the modern era to overthrow a state, and then China and then Iran afterwards, all these countries think about conflict as being fundamentally mental, as in psychologically based and in the mind, and fundamentally beginning with propaganda. And so if things can be achieved via propaganda, via assassination, via paramilitary violence, via non-military forms of conflict, these are always cheaper and more effective. And we see these forms of conflict, Iran practicing against Israel, but also China against us. I remember trying to get Huawei out of the 5G network in this country. When it was a deliberate play by the Chinese to try to dominate 5G. I mean, we can talk about the reasons why, but I remember repeatedly being told, we're not in conflict with China, it's a private company. No, it's not, it's a communist state. They don't have private companies in a communist state. And you had a conservative minister telling me this. I couldn't believe it. You know, but this form of war, for a variety of reasons, is likely to be a template for warfare this century. And I wrote this book because, as I say, not enough of our great and good actually understand the world we're living in and understand the form of conflict that we are, forms of conflict that we are facing. And so for me it was important to try to write this so that actually I could say, here is the reality of this situation, here is what is actually happening, and this is potentially what we need to do about it as well. I have talked for too long, so I'm going to leave it there and see if people want to take any questions, but thank you so much indeed for listening. Thank you.